After the shot, the rifle felt familiar in Jack Mallow's hands, worn wood and cold steel that fit against his shoulder like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. From the dusty attic window of the abandoned hardware store, he had a perfect view of the town square, where Mayor Richard Shelby stood behind a podium decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, delivering his annual 4th of July speech to a crowd of maybe 200 people. Jack adjusted the scope and centered the crosshairs on Shelby's chest. The range was 87 meters, an easy shot for a man who'd put holes in targets at 10 times that distance, in places where missing meant his squad didn't come home. His finger rested on the trigger, steady despite the pint of whiskey he'd finished that morning, and the tremor in his left hand that had been getting worse since the VA stopped his disability payments. Before I continue the story, head to the comments and tell me which city you're watching from. Fellow Americans. Shelby's amplified voice drifted up through the summer heat. We gather today to celebrate the freedoms that our brave servicemen and women have died to protect. Jack squeezed the trigger. The .308 round punched into the stone base of the memorial statue 3 inches from Shelby's feet, sending chips of granite flying and a sharp crack echoing across the square. The mayor dropped behind the podium as if he'd been shot, and the crowd exploded into screaming chaos as people ran for cover behind cars and buildings. Jack worked the bolt and chambered another round, but he didn't fire again. Instead, he set the rifle down carefully and sat back against the wall, waiting for what came next. 8 minutes later, he walked out of the building with his hands raised, moving slowly and deliberately as a dozen police officers shouted conflicting orders about getting down and showing his hands and not moving. They cuffed him on the sidewalk while Mayor Shelby stood behind a police car, pale and shaking, but uninjured. Jack Mallow, he said to the arresting officer. Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. The rifle's upstairs, unloaded, safety on. He didn't resist. He didn't explain. He just sat quietly in the back of the patrol car and watched his hometown's Independence Day celebration dissolve into sirens and yellow tape. The questioning room at the county sheriff's office smelled like disinfectant and fear. Detective Sarah Martinez had seen her share of disturbed veterans over the years, men and women who'd come back from war zones with pieces of themselves missing, struggling to fit into a world that expected them to just get over it and move on. Why didn't you kill him? She asked Jack, who sat across from her looking more tired than dangerous. You had the shot. You're obviously trained. Why miss? Jack studied his hands, noting how the scars from shrapnel had faded over the years, but never disappeared entirely. Who says I missed? You're telling me you meant to hit the statue? I'm telling you that if I'd wanted Mayor Shelby dead, you'd be planning his funeral right now instead of asking me questions. Detective Martinez opened the file folder she'd brought from her desk. Jack Mallow, 52 years old. Army sniper, multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, commendations for valor. Discharged in 2018, worked private security until 2021, then... She looked up. Then nothing. No job, no fixed address, disability claim denied. Sounds about right. What happened in 2021? Jack was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the institutional green walls of the interrogation room. My squad got ambushed outside Ramadi. 4 good soldiers died because some major back in the air-conditioned command post decided we needed to make a statement, sent us into a sector that hadn't been cleared, told us intelligence showed it was safe. That major being Richard Shelby? That major being Richard Shelby. Though he wasn't mayor then, just another career officer playing politics with other people's lives. Martinez made notes. And you blame him for your squad's deaths? I don't blame him for anything. I know he's responsible. There's a difference. She pulled out another document. According to the after-action report, your squad volunteered for that mission. Shelby wrote that you specifically requested the assignment. Jack laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Of course he did. The story might have ended there, another troubled veteran taking out his frustrations on a public official. Except that Jessica Chen, a reporter for the local newspaper, had a brother who'd served in Afghanistan and knew how to read between the lines of military records. She'd covered enough veteran suicides and PTSD cases to recognize the pattern. Good soldiers coming home broken, getting tangled up in bureaucratic red tape, falling through cracks that seemed designed to make problems disappear quietly. But something about Jack Mallow's case felt different. For one thing, his military record was exemplary. Multiple tours, consistently high-performance evaluations, no disciplinary actions. For another, the shooting itself was too precise to be random. Missing by 3 inches at 87 meters wasn't an accident. It was a message. Chen started making phone calls. The first break came from a clerk at the VA hospital in Phoenix, where Jack had been treated for injuries sustained in the Ramadi ambush. The clerk wasn't supposed to talk to reporters, but she'd seen too many veterans get screwed by the system to keep quiet when it mattered. He wrote letters, she told Chen over the phone. Before the mission, after it went bad, during his medical treatment, kept asking for someone to review the intelligence reports, said there were inconsistencies in the official story. Do you still have copies? I'm not supposed to. But yes. And there's something else. He filed a formal complaint about the mission orders, said he'd requested a delay until the sector could be properly surveilled. The second break came from a former staff sergeant named Mike Torres, who'd served as Shelby's radio operator during that deployment. Torres had been medically discharged after an IED took his left leg, and he'd spent the years since then trying to forget what he'd seen in Iraq. Chen found him working at an auto parts store in Tucson, living quietly and avoiding anything that reminded him of the war. But when she mentioned Jack Mallow and the Ramadi mission, something changed in his expression. I remember that day, he said quietly. Major Shelby got a call from someone back in the green zone. Civilian contractor, I think. They were talking about oil surveys, access routes, something about clearing the area for commercial operations. And then Major Shelby called in Jack's squad for an immediate patrol, said they needed to show force in the sector, demonstrate that we controlled the territory. Torres was quiet for a moment, staring at a rack of air filters as if they held answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. Jack radioed back, said his spotters were reporting movement in the buildings, asked for time to call in air support for reconnaissance. Major Shelby denied the request, said the mission was time-sensitive. Did you report this? To who? Shelby was the one who wrote the reports. And by the time Jack's squad got hit, I was on a medevac bird with my leg blown off. Chen thanked him and drove back to town with a story that was starting to look less like veteran vigilantism and more like delayed justice. The arraignment was supposed to be a formality. Jack Mallow would plead not guilty, get assigned a public defender, and disappear into the prison system where inconvenient veterans went to be forgotten. But Jessica Chen's story had been picked up by wire services, and suddenly, a small-town attempted murder case was attracting national attention. Outside the courthouse, a group of veterans held a silent vigil. They didn't carry signs or chant slogans. They just stood at attention in their old uniforms and dress blues, bearing witness to something their brother-in-arms had felt compelled to do when the system failed him. Inside, Jack sat next to his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named David Kim, who'd taken the case expecting a routine plea bargain, and found himself representing a symbol of everything wrong with how America treated its war veterans. "Mr. Mallow," Judge Patricia Williams said, "you're charged with attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and terrorist threatening. How do you plead?" Jack stood slowly. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on a frame that had once carried 200 pounds of muscle, and now looked gaunt from months of poor nutrition and worse sleeping. "Your Honor, I plead not guilty, and I'd like to make a statement." The judge looked surprised. "Mr. Mallow, your attorney should advise you." "Your Honor, with respect, I've been advised by the best legal minds in this country for 30 years. They advised me that the chain of command was sacred. They advised me that following orders was paramount. They advised me that the mission always came first." Jack's voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who'd led soldiers into combat and brought most of them home. "Those advisors sent me and my men into an ambush because it served someone's financial interests. When my soldiers died, those same advisors covered it up. When I tried to get answers, they denied my disability claims and erased my service record." He looked directly at Mayor Shelby, who sat in the front row with his attorney and his political advisors. "I fired one shot yesterday. If I'd wanted Mayor Shelby dead, you'd be planning his funeral instead of his re-election campaign. I wanted him to remember, for just one moment, what it felt like to be afraid. What it felt like to have someone else control whether you lived or died." The courtroom was completely silent. I spent 26 years protecting this country. I watched good soldiers die for bad decisions made by politicians who never heard a shot fired in anger. And when I came home, the same politicians who sent us to war decided we were too expensive to take care of. Jack sat down as heavily as if he'd been carrying a 100-pound pack for miles. "I'm not sorry I scared Mayor Shelby. I'm sorry I waited so long to do it." The confession tape surfaced 3 days later, leaked by someone in the district attorney's office who'd apparently grown tired of watching justice get buried under political expedients. In the recording, Mayor Shelby's voice was clear and unmistakable as he spoke to his attorney about potential plea negotiations. "Yes, I ordered the patrol. Yes, I knew the intelligence was incomplete. But it was a war zone. You make decisions with imperfect information. Besides, we needed to establish a presence in that sector for the oil survey teams." The attorney's voice was harder to hear, but his questions were pointed. Had Shelby received direct orders to clear the area? Had he considered the risks to the patrol? Did he know about Sergeant Mallow's request for a delay? "Look," Shelby replied. "Mallow was always overcautious. Good soldier, but he didn't understand the bigger picture. We had a narrow window to secure that territory before the contractors arrived. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks." "And the 4 soldiers who died?" A long pause, then. "War is hell. People die. That's not my fault. That's just reality." The recording went viral within hours. By evening, veterans organizations across the country were demanding investigations. By the next morning, protesters had surrounded City Hall calling for Shelby's resignation. But Jack Mallow never heard the confession that vindicated everything he'd tried to say for years. He suffered a massive stroke in his cell that night, alone, except for the guard who found him the next morning slumped against the concrete wall, his face peaceful for the first time since he'd come home from war. Take a pause and write in the comments what you would do in the hero's place. Now keep listening. The funeral drew thousands of veterans from across the Southwest. They came in their dress uniforms and their civilian clothes, their motorcycle vests and their Sunday best, united by the understanding that one of their own had finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. Mayor Richard Shelby resigned the day before the service, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with his family. The resignation letter made no mention of Iraq, of dead soldiers, or of the confession that had ended his political career. Jack was buried in the military section of the municipal cemetery, with full honors and a 21-gun salute that echoed across the desert like distant thunder. The headstone bore his name, his rank, his dates of service, and a simple inscription chosen by his surviving squad mates. He brought his men home. Jessica Chen covered the funeral for her newspaper, but she also kept a private record of the investigation that had started with one shot fired in anger and ended with a man who'd carried the weight of war longer than any soldier should have to. In her notes, she wrote, "Jack Mallow didn't die in Iraq, but he didn't survive it either. He came home carrying his dead friends and the knowledge that their sacrifice had been wasted by politicians who measured success in dollars rather than lives. He spent his last years trying to get someone to acknowledge that truth. And when words failed, he used the only language he had left." The abandoned hardware store where Jack had taken his shot was torn down a month later, replaced by a small memorial park with a bench facing the town square. Veterans often sat there in the evenings, watching the sunset and remembering their own wars, their own losses, their own struggles to find meaning in survival. The brass plaque on the bench read, "In memory of those who served, those who fell, and those who carry both burdens home." Below that, in smaller letters, "Some shots echo forever." Mayor Shelby moved to another state and took a job with a defense contractor, where his experience with military operations made him valuable in ways that didn't require public accountability. He never spoke publicly about Iraq again, or about the soldiers who died on his orders, or about the one who'd lived long enough to remind him that some debts can never be fully paid. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake from dreams of desert heat and gunfire, and for just a moment he would remember what it felt like to be in someone else's crosshairs, helpless and afraid, waiting for a decision that someone else would make about whether he deserved to live another day. In those moments, he almost understood why Jack Mallow had pulled the trigger. Almost.